This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Exit polls expected this hour as voting closes in South Korea's local elections, viewed as the first nationwide test for President Lee Jae Myung. Now, Japan's cabinet has approved a $19 billion support package to help households weather rising living costs, with energy prices climbing amid the Middle East conflict. A fresh tariff threat from Washington. The U.S. is proposing tariffs of at least 10% on imports from 60 economies, including China, Japan, and South Korea, over forced labor concerns. Also, renewed UK-China ties are beginning to deliver results, and a new report from the British Chamber of Commerce in China says that practical engagement will be key to sustaining those gains.
Computex is once again putting Taiwan at the center of the global AI conversation. From AI PCs to next-generation data centers, companies are racing to define what's next in the age of AI. One company at the heart of it is Asus, which started life in a coffee shop here in Taipei. I'm Victoria Jen at Computex, and I speak with Asus co-CEO Samson Hu about how AI will redefine PCs as we know them, and what makes Taiwan the epicenter of the AI revolution.
Voting precincts are closing in South Korea's local elections. It is the first test of Lee Jae Myung's leadership since he became president last year. Polling stations opened for 12 hours from 6 a.m. local time. And more than 44 million people are eligible to vote for mayors and governors in 16 cities and provinces. Now, the elections will help gauge support for President Lee's second year in office and his national agenda. Well, for more on this, we are joined now by CNA senior correspondent Lim Yoon-suk, live from Seoul. Yoon-suk, so tell us more about the turnout level. What does it say about voter engagement in such elections?
Well, we're still waiting for the final official turnout figures right now, but it shows like it's about 59%, and that makes it significantly higher than this 50.9% that was recorded in the previous local elections in 2022. Now, in fact, there were some signs that turnout exceeded expectations in some areas. In Seoul's Songpa district, apparently officials were running short of ballot papers, and so they were bringing in additional supplies. Now, many analysts here are saying that this high turnout could be seen as a sign that voters are becoming more engaged and seeing this election as carrying this greater political significance. Now, we also saw a record high of more than 23% during the 2 days of early voting, suggesting that many South Koreans were highly motivated to cast their ballots. Now, analysts saying that part of the reason is that these elections are being viewed as the first major electoral test of President Lee Jae Myung's administration since he took office last year. And so voters were not only choosing mayors and governors, but they are sending this strong, a broader political message about the direction of where they want to see the country going. Now, several closely watched areas, including here in Seoul, have also helped drive this interest, with candidates focusing heavily on issues such as housing and the economy. Now, another aspect of this election gaining attention is this growing number of foreign residents allowed to vote in local elections. Now, in this election, there are more than 150,000 foreign permanent residents who are eligible to vote, and this has reignited this debate over who should have a say in the local politics. Now, let me first share with you my story. In South Korea's June 3rd elections, naturalized citizen Kang Kwang-bin campaigned for a seat on the local district council in Seoul's Taerim-dong. It's home to one of the country's largest ethnic Chinese communities. Mr. Kang's candidacy drew attention to a little-known feature of the electoral system, one that has gained renewed attention in recent years. South Korea allows foreign nationals with permanent residency to vote in local elections, which is unusual in Asia. To qualify, voters must be at least 18 years old and have held permanent residency for at least 3 years. In this election, more than 151,000 foreign residents were eligible to vote. That's up from about 6,700 in 2006 when the system was first introduced. Local governments and campaigns produced multilingual materials to reach foreign residents more directly. Gyeonggi Province, for instance, issued voter information posters in 13 languages, including English, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Nepali. The effort reflects a broader attempt to engage an increasingly diverse electorate.
또 오래 생활해서 영주권을 딴 거거든요. 우리가 우리 손으로 뽑을 수 있고, 열심히 우리를 위해서 뛰어주신 분들 뽑는 게 우리가 사는데, 우리 하나의 발언권을 주잖아요. 그러면 당연히 투표권이 있어야 된다고.
그냥 안 하겠어 일만 해다 나니까 그런데 잘 모르고 있는데 아무 분이 나와서든 간에 그래서 잘만 해주면 좋겠어요.
But the issue has become increasingly controversial in recent years. Critics argue that voting rights should be tied to nationality and reciprocity, pointing out that South Koreans living in countries such as China and Japan largely do not enjoy similar rights. The debate has focused particularly on Chinese nationals who, according to the National Assembly Budget Office, accounted for nearly 80% of eligible foreign voters in previous local elections.
제 개인적인 관점은 중국인의 수가 늘어감에 따라 이 이슈가 더 촉발된 것은 분명하다라고 생각을 합니다. 이게 왜냐하면 최근에 한국인들의 특히 반중 감정이 엄청나게 늘어났습니다.
But Professor Kim says the broader question is how South Korea manages immigration as it grapples with an aging population and a declining birth rate.
이 논의의 초점을 특정 국가의 중국인에게 맞추지 말고 우리가 어떤 이민 사회로 나아갈 것인가라고 하는 좀 더 거대 감론에서의 사회적 논의들이 좀 건설적으로 이루어질 수 있으면.
With South Korea expected to rely increasingly on immigration to offset demographic decline, the debate over who gets a say in local politics is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. And, whether South Koreans support or oppose this policy, I think the issue is now going to be something very difficult for politicians to ignore.
Right, and so now that voting has closed, what are some of the first indications that we are getting from the exit polls?
Well, right now, the exit polls suggest that the ruling Democratic Party is headed for a strong showing across much of the country. Now, if those projections are confirmed, then it would indicate that the political fallout from former President Yoon Suk-yeol's removal from office continues to weigh heavily on this conservative camp. Now, for President Lee Jae Myung, the result would certainly be seen as an important, early boost, given that these elections are widely viewed as the first major test of his administration. But more broadly, I think voters do not appear to be seeking a strong check on this government at this stage now. Now, for the ruling Democratic Party, it would be a sign that voters are not only backing President Lee Jae Myung, but also placing their confidence in the party more broadly. But for the opposition People Power Party, I think the projections suggest that it still faces this uphill battle to convince voters that it has moved beyond the turmoil of that past year and can once again present itself as a credible alternative.
All right, thanks for helping us unpack South Korea politics. CNA senior correspondent Lim Yeon-suk reporting to us live from Seoul. Now, today's election highlights issues ranging from immigration to economic growth, but many young South Koreans remain focused on a different question. Who gets access to opportunity? Now, a boom in AI and semiconductor industries is turning some of the sector's employees into the latest symbols of success and upward mobility. We've got Grace Chin joining us now to help us unpack this all. So, Grace, first up, help us understand how exactly did semiconductor workers become South Korea's supposed newest status symbol?
Well, as South Korea's AI boom has driven up semiconductor stocks and boosted bonuses at companies like Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, an unusual trend has emerged online. Employees at these firms are increasingly being treated as the latest status symbol or the elite class. And you can see that by one post that really went viral in South Korea. South Korea's secondhand marketplace 당근 showed what appeared to be an SK Hynix employee jacket. But what was notable is that the seller described it as the ultimate blind date outfit, referring to if you're meeting a man with this ultimate blind date outfit, he's the perfect one to go for. And this trend was even featured as a parody on a very famous South Korean comedy show called SNL Korea. But there may be some truth behind that humor because I reached out to one of the major matchmaking agencies called Kayon, and they told me that Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix employees are increasingly viewed as attractive partners because of what has been noted on news headlines, whether it be their compensation, financial stability, and job security in this AI landscape. And they even compared it to it being equivalent to the traditionally coveted job occupations like a lawyer or a doctor. So I even asked someone who has worked at both companies whether he had experienced this type of societal hype surrounding his occupation. So why don't we take a listen?
I guess maybe there is a little bit of a pinch of jealousy from my peers, and they do say, you're so lucky and, you're so fortunate to work for such a good company. And those are all good to hear, but we also work very hard and if the company is doing well, I also feel that the employees should share in the benefit.
Well, it's interesting to know what a blind date outfit now is in Korea. But clearly this isn't just affecting workers already employed at these places like Samsung and SK Hynix. We're even seeing reports that semiconductor-focused high schools. So it's also becoming increasingly popular among students and parents. But the question is, how deep does this trend go?
I think it's very deep because, as you mentioned, a recent Korea Herald report found that semiconductor-focused high schools have seen surging demand with more students wanting to come in as they're seeing it being the latest golden pathway to enter into companies like Samsung and SK Hynix through their early adulthood. So it's no longer just about today's workers. It's about how it's shaping even young South Korean students to think about their future careers. And according to a sociologist that I spoke to, he said the bigger story here is how South Korea's society is designed. And he says it's based on inequality. He says that while inequality has been widening across many developed economies, which includes the United States, countries in Europe, and Japan, the pace of change in South Korea and the pace of inequality is particularly striking. He mentioned that the gap between large conglomerates and smaller firms, as well as between regular and non-regular workers, has widened significantly, which explains why many of the pressures that many young South Koreans face these days is quite visible in the form of risky investment, whether they take on debt to enter the hyped-up stock market. So let's take a listen to what he said about South Korea's societal trend, which is widening inequality.
생존을 위한 어떤 각자 도생 사회에서의 생존을 위한 전략일 수도 있고, 또 한편으로는 내가 다른 사람보다 더 우월하지 않으면 다른 사람한테 무시당할 수도 있다는 그런 추락의 공포의 결과일 수도 있고요. 그래서 명백하게 이거는 단순히 개인의 심리나 선택의 문제가 아니라 한국 사회 전체가 갖고 있는 어떤 경제적 불평등의 구조의 심화 속에서 나타나는 하나의 사회적인 분위기의 변화라고 볼 수 있죠.
So I hear what the professor is saying, this broadening a social mood in South Korea, but why does this actually matter on election day, though?
It's because, based on the conversation we had, Professor Kim argues that many of the concerns driving this phenomenon have barely been featured in the election campaign itself. Behind the fascination with Samsung and SK lies a broader anxiety about jobs, housing, and social mobility, which is exactly why Professor Kim called for change. Take a listen.
청년들의 실질적인 복지 문제나 일자리나 또는 주거나 결혼이나 이런 문제에 대한 사회 정책을 이 노동시장 양극화, 기술의 고도화에 맞춰서 하지 않는다면 더 심각한 부작용이 나타날 가능성이 매우 크죠.
So for this research, though I started off with a seemingly lighthearted meme about an SK Hynix jacket being the ultimate blind date look, it's a much deeper debate about inequality and opportunity in South Korea, which is definitely an issue that voters have been keeping an eye out, and we'll see how the administration will take forward.
That's true, and we'll be keeping a close eye on those exit polls and the results. Thanks so very much, Grace, for joining us this evening. Right, on that note, let's go for a breather now. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight. Chinese sportswear giants are making a play for the world's biggest stars. A discussion on how they're challenging established leaders like Nike and Adidas. Next. Hello again. Good to have your company this Wednesday on East Asia Tonight. Well, several Asian economies, including China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, could face new U.S. tariffs. Well, Roland Lim is here to tell us with all the latest details. Roland, what do you have for us?
Thanks, Natalie. Yes, U.S. President Trump's administration has proposed additional levies of 10 or 12.5% on imports from 60 major trading partners. The office of the U.S. Trade Representative made the announcement after an investigation determined that those economies failed to curb trade on goods allegedly made with forced labor. The probe was launched under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Now, most are facing a duty of 12.5%. They include China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. Now, others that have imposed or committed to impose forced labor restrictions would be subject to a lower levy of 10%. They include the European Union and Taiwan. Beijing has criticized Washington's actions. It has denied suggestions of forced labor and said that trade issues should be sorted out in discussions. New Delhi, Tokyo, and Seoul said they are in close contact with Washington on the matter. The European Parliament's Trade Committee has called the U.S. Trade Representative's findings utterly absurd. It said that the EU has adopted the world's strictest legislation on products made with forced labor. The committee head pointed out as well that the proposed 10% levy was above the 15% duty framework agreed in August last year. The U.S. levies will not go into effect immediately. Written comments are to be sent by the 6th of July, and public hearings expected to start the next day. The U.S. Trade Office's proposal comes after the country's Supreme Court struck down most of President Trump's so-called Liberation Day levies. Now, that move prompted him to enact 10% baseline duties under a Trade Act provision. But they are due to expire next month and are being subject to a legal challenge as well. A big tech announcement making headlines this week is NVIDIA's entry into the consumer personal computer arena. Now, NVIDIA's new RTX Spark superchip could be available in consumer laptops later this year, significantly upgrading the device's AI capabilities. Now, one of the companies collaborating with NVIDIA on this is Taiwan tech giant Asus. Its co-CEO Samson Hu, who sat down with CNA to discuss AI, that's Taiwan's role in its global tech race and navigating US-China tensions. But first, CNA's senior correspondent Victoria Jen started by asking him how these AI PCs will be a game changer.
Actually, it's a very exciting achievement in terms of its powerful AI computing capability. I think it can deliver up to several hundred of TOPS AI computing performance, which is really very practical for the agentic AI computing experience. So I think this year, this is a very important announcement from both Asus and NVIDIA.
Asus has predicted that the AI PC is going to take up 60% of the market share. And when do you expect that to happen?
Well, we think the AI PC penetration rate will go beyond 50% this year and reach 60% or even higher from year 2027. And the background to support this growth is because of the AI experience keep evolving from generative AI to agentic AI. And with agentic AI, you can imagine that people can define the goal, define the outcome, and define the intent, or even define the constraint to the agentic AI. And then agentic AI can perceive, can reason, and understand, and act to execute the task for people. So it's a totally new experience. So this kind of totally new experience will help to drive the AI PC's growth in the coming years.
Taiwan is at the center of the global supply chain. How is Taiwan positioned in the AI race, and what kind of role does Asus play?
Well, Taiwan plays a central role in the global AI ecosystem, from semiconductor, system design, key component, infrastructure, and even the manufacturing. You know that Taiwan is the worldwide strongest AI server supply chain, covering the semiconductor I just mentioned, and all the way to the power supply, PCB, networking, and so on. And I think Taiwan plays a very good foundation of the whole AI ecosystem. And Asus will be the key enabler to integrate all together, from our AI server infrastructure to edge computing devices and to AI PCs.
How do you manage to navigate the growing tensions between the US and China, the world's two biggest markets?
We are diversified across consumer, commercial, enterprise, and the infrastructure, so that we can keep safe during the changes of different market cycle or even this kind of tension. At the same time, in terms of the supply chain, we maintain the agile and the flexible supply chain so that we can navigate the trade challenge and also to navigate the regulatory changes, such as this kind of tension between two big countries. And I can share with you that today, 90% of our US-bound motherboard and the PCs are now manufactured in Southeast Asia, for example, in Vietnam, in Thailand, in Indonesia. And as far as our server products, we already built the manufacturing site in US already to comply the local policy.
Lots of buzz in the past day or so around a major brand endorsement deal. Golden State Warriors star Stephen Curry has inked a 10-year tie-up with Li Ning. A contract reportedly worth some $400 million. It was signed as the Chinese sportswear giant is seeking to reignite growth in a sluggish domestic consumer market. Now, Curry is the latest high-profile American basketball player to partner with a Chinese brand, as domestic players and Western competitors such as Nike and Adidas vie for endorsement deals with the world's top athletes. Our sports-related consumption has been a rare bright spot amid lackluster domestic demand. Euromonitor says that China's sportswear market is estimated to reach more than $66 billion next year.
So the question is, what's behind this growing momentum, and are traditional giants like Nike and Adidas losing ground, especially in China? Well, Roland is staying behind to tell us more about that. First up, just how big a deal is it that Curry's move in the bigger picture of the global sportswear market?
It's a very significant deal. I mean, Steph Curry is not just a top athlete, he's also a very bankable star. I mean, he's got a strong following and he has, lots of fans both in the US and in China. On top of that, this goes beyond a sponsorship deal. I say that because it signals that Chinese sportswear brands are now able to compete in the elite global endorsement arena. So that's long been dominated by the likes of Nike and Adidas. So it does reflect a broader perception shift that these companies no longer want to be domestic players. They want to be seen as international players with scale and with ambition.
I know it is very impressive. So let's just talk about those players then. I mean, who are the key Chinese brands that's driving this growth, and how far have they come?
Yeah, the two big names, of course, Anta and Li-Ning, although there are such others up-and-comers like X-Step or 361 Degrees or Peak. Anta is the standout. Anta is one of the biggest global sportswear brands around through aggressive acquisition and expansion. It controls the Fila brand in China. It's also got a stake in Amer Sports, which has brands in its portfolio such as Salomon, as well as Arc'teryx as well. So it's big. Li-Ning, of course, it took a different route because Li-Ning himself, the founder was a former Chinese Olympic gymnast, and he focused on design and he focused on the cultural identity. So they went big into design, they went big into sportswear, they went big into basketball. And this latest deal with Steph Curry really is building up on previous endorsements with the likes of Dwayne Wade as well as Jimmy Butler.
Right. So we have time for one last question, Roland. So I want to ask then, do you think Nike and Adidas, they're worried? How worried should they be? I mean, or are we just talking about a China story here?
Well, I think for right now, Adidas and Nike don't have anything to worry about. They're global giants. They're unmatched in terms of brand recognition. I mean, distribution networks, decades associated with elite sports. But Chinese brands are coming up. And the direction, I think, is very clear. The Chinese sportswear companies are becoming more sophisticated. They know their domestic markets. They're improving their quality. And the global sportswear industry, I guess, in the very far future, maybe, that it's going to be more than just a two-brand story, i.e. Nike and Adidas.
I think it is a very exciting space to watch. Thanks so much for your analysis, Roland. Right, on that note, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia Tonight, the latest report by the British Chamber of Commerce in China. Regulatory uncertainty remains a key challenge even as UK-China engagement bears fruit. And we're going to be speaking to the chair of the chamber himself, Chris Torrance, when we return. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Exit polls in South Korea's local election show President Lee Jae Myung's Democratic Party projected to win at least 10 out of 16 key local election races. Japan's cabinet has approved a $19 billion support package to help households weather rising living costs, with energy prices climbing amid the Middle East conflict. And a fresh tariff threat from Washington. The U.S. is proposing tariffs of at least 10% on imports from 60 countries, including China, Japan, and South Korea, over forced labor concerns. A Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's cabinet has approved a $19.5 billion supplementary budget to help households struggling with rising energy costs as the Middle East conflict drags on. But this extra budget is raising concerns about Japan's fiscal health among observers. Well, CNA senior correspondent Michio Ishida has more.
The bulk of the supplementary budget will go towards forming a new 2.5 trillion yen or $15.6 billion reserve fund to respond to the instability in the Middle East, where Japan sources about 95% of its oil. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi wants to use the reserve fund to subsidize the retail cost of petrol and reduce bills for electricity and gas from July to September. That's usually the hottest time of the year when demand for energy rises. The government has been providing fuel subsidies from its existing reserve fund, which is usually kept for emergencies such as natural disasters. But this is gradually being depleted. It is unusual for a supplementary budget to be pushed through this early in the fiscal year, which began in April. The government says it will be funded with deficit-covering bonds, supported by higher-than-expected government revenues in fiscal year 2025, and expects a minimal impact on Japan's fiscal health. But analysts have expressed concern that a substantial additional budget would further worsen its national debt. Japan has the biggest debt to GDP ratio among industrialized countries, more than double its economic output. The cabinet has submitted the supplementary budget to the Diet and is expected to pass on Friday. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
Renewed engagement between China and the UK is beginning to deliver real benefits for businesses. Well, that's according to the British Chamber of Commerce in China, ahead of the release of its annual report on the business environment in the world's second biggest economy. Now, the report points to recent efforts by Beijing and London to strengthen ties, including the UK Prime Minister's visit to China in January. It says that stronger government dialogue can lead to better outcomes for companies in both markets. Now, the Chamber also says that China's development plans are creating new opportunities for British companies, but it warns of lingering challenges, including regulatory hurdles, weak consumer spending, and geopolitical tensions. Well, to further unpack the findings of the report, we are joined now by Chris Torrance, Chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in China. Well, thanks, Chris, for joining us this evening. So let's just start with the headline report from what you've discovered is that you've argued that renewed UK-China engagement is starting to deliver these practical benefits for businesses. But when you say that, what does that actually look like on the ground for a company operating in China today?
So thanks very much for having me on the show. Yeah, we're seeing the results of sustained government engagement at a very senior level over the last 2 years. Obviously, we had the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, in January. We've had the Business Secretary, Peter Kyle, twice, once with Mr. Starmer and then once last year. We've had Chancellor Rachel Reeves, former Secretary, Foreign Secretary David Lammy, and obviously Yvette Cooper's been here. And that's helped to build this bilateral momentum. And every time we have a senior government official visiting, business gets to be in the room with senior Chinese government leaders. And it really allows us to shift the needle and to make progress in terms of some of the market access challenges that British businesses face on the ground. So the overall result is, we've made progress in some key areas, and there's a real sense of positivity and optimism, which is reflected in the British Chamber of Commerce China position paper, which we're publishing tomorrow.
So when you talked about these senior UK ministers continuing to visit China, including Yvette Cooper this week, this bilateral momentum you see that's being built up. So what sort of specific issues do you think British companies would like to see move from discussion to action?
So first and foremost, it's great to be getting more senior engagement with Chinese government stakeholders, and obviously having UK visitors helps with that. As you mentioned in the introduction, it's a complex operating environment from a regulatory perspective. It is difficult. There's often not that much transparency or predictability about regulations and then the implementation. But I think the bigger challenges facing British businesses are one, the geopolitical backdrop. Obviously, US-China relations kind of affect overall foreign business confidence in China. And then most importantly, for our members and British businesses across the country, the economic challenges of dealing and operating in a market where consumer sentiment is not where investors would like it to be. So we are a long way away from the pre-COVID 2019 days of very strong consumer growth. And although China has around 5% GDP growth, at the moment, a lot of that is made up from exports and from capital investments, and so that weak consumer sentiment is a challenge for businesses. Obviously, the government's doing its best to provide stimulus, but we're really seeing evolving consumption trends, and that's moving away from some of the stronger consumption that we've seen in the past.
So sluggish consumer demand, that's one. But in terms of other challenges, though, I mean, based on your recommendations, it seems like some have been resolved, and there are still others on the list, quite a long list that's not resolved at this point. So just walk us through what are some of the challenges that are easiest to solve, and also the ones that continue to prove more difficult?
Yeah, so one of the big wins we've had over the last 12 months has been getting visa-free access for British nationals. That's really transforming how, I think, UK perceptions of, how people see China. It's made it a lot easier for businesses, maybe smaller, medium-sized enterprises who are just coming over and have, cost to control. We've seen whiskey tariffs lifted. We're seeing progress in the sports sector, and even in some services where obviously the UK is a world leader. Still progress that needs to be made there. I think some of the market access challenges do relate to legal services, financial services, export control. So there are still a number of we have more than 40 recommendations that we've put forward to the Chinese government within the position paper, and many of those recommendations have been in the paper since we actually kicked off the whole report some 8 years ago. So these are long-standing measures relating to market access issues in some of the more sensitive sectors, or at least the way China sees it, areas like the law firms and financial services. But we're really encouraged by the progress that's being made, because we have seen progress even in the area of legal services. And we're looking forward to getting greater recognition, for example, of in sectors where the UK is a world leader. So looking at education and recognition of professional qualifications, certification, that kind of thing. So we feel like we're going in the right direction anyway.
So UK-China business relationship, it's evolving. I hear what you're saying about the opportunities ahead. But as China prepares its next 5-year plan, and also in your report, it states that more Chinese companies are looking overseas. How then are British firms repositioning themselves and, to seize the biggest opportunities ahead?
Well, in terms of inbound investment into China, the UK is a leader in healthcare, in biopharma, in parts of technology. We have education, we have services, as I've mentioned. All of these areas align very nicely with Chinese national strategy. So we see the UK and China kind of aligned on some key areas of growth. So that's a really positive step. And we're seeing growth as well, as I mentioned, in sports and creative industries as well. So in terms of British businesses operating in China and expanding here, that's a positive picture. But I think the more positive picture, the area where there's greater potential, is to support those Chinese companies that are going out, that are going global. And of course, there are some Chinese multinationals that have been doing that for decades. If you look at the energy sector, for example, Chinese companies in the state sector have been going out for decades. We've had some pioneers in terms of Chinese companies like Huawei, like Haier, like Lenovo, Geely, which acquired Volvo back in 2007. But the vast majority of Chinese companies going out now, they're pretty new to venturing overseas. And that's where UK service companies can play a really good role, not just supporting Chinese companies going into the UK, but supporting them going into markets that they're completely unfamiliar with. So that's where we see a lot of potential in terms of stronger UK-Chinese partnerships.
And of course, all of this unfolding against a rather, complex geopolitical backdrop. And I suppose businesses, they've been somewhat accustomed to operating against, such geopolitical tension. But how are British companies actually, balancing those risks while at the same time, trying to look for the growth opportunities in China?
Well, it's tough. You're right. As I mentioned, the US-China relationship pretty much defines foreign investment into China. And so UK-China relations are not immune to that. British businesses, in many cases have very strongly China-focused supply chains, and those can come under threat or come under pressure when there are tensions between the US and China. So I think many British companies are holding tight. They're hopeful that there will be a lasting trade deal between the US and China. We have to remember that Presidents Trump and Xi will be seeing each other, all being well, 4 times this year. They've already had Trump's visit to Beijing, but President Xi will be back he'll be visiting the US, I think, around September 24th or so. Then we have the APEC summit in Shenzhen in November. And then they'll also meet at the in Florida when President Xi goes back to the US. So we're hoping that relationship and that sustained engagement will lead to some kind of trade deal. But for the moment, businesses lack that predictability, they lack that certainty, and that creates challenges for British businesses operating here.
And Chris, just before we let you go, we have to look to the future, of course. And, if we were sitting here a year from now having this same conversation, tell us, what do you think needs to happen for you to say that, UK-China engagement is genuinely making a difference for British businesses?
So I think keeping up the cadence of senior government engagement, that's key. That will help move the needle in terms of greater market access, getting a more predictable operating environment, if that's possible here, a little more transparency, a little more working together. And we're already seeing that with the establishment of working groups and technical groups between UK and China. And then I think a bit more progress, which should come based on the previous two kind of steps being made, a bit more progress in terms of services companies partnering up with Chinese companies, and then more healthcare investment coming into China, which we've seen already. And then those growth areas like sports, wellness, healthcare, these are all areas where China and UK are aligned. So we're pretty positive about the next 12 months.
Okay, well, I look forward to having that conversation with you again. Thanks so very much for your time and thoughts. Chris Torrance, Chair of the British Chamber of Commerce in China. The Solomon Islands is set to review a 2022 security pact with China, which rattled the US and Australia by opening the door to Chinese forces in the South Pacific. Now, the country's new Prime Minister announced a review in Canberra on his first overseas trip since taking office.
I've been praying and fasting about it. But of course, Cabinet will need to have a look at these things. There is a non-disclosure clause in it, so I couldn't show it to you right away. But we are going to be reviewing, as we are reviewing other security agreements that we have with many other countries.
Well, the agreement allows China to deploy police, armed personnel, and other law enforcement officers to the Pacific nation. The US and Australia fear that this could pave the way for a permanent Chinese naval presence in the region. Well, Australia and the Solomon Islands will now negotiate a new comprehensive strategic treaty, which will include a support package to help the Solomons tackle high energy prices. Canberra says it wants to remain the Pacific's preferred security partner. Leaders also pledging to reset relations after years of strain. US and South Korean officials have met in Seoul for a second day of security talks on nuclear cooperation. South Korea aims to launch its first nuclear-powered submarine by the mid-2030s to guard against threats from the north. For that, it needs to secure the right to enrich uranium and reprocess spent nuclear fuel for civilian use. But an existing agreement bars Seoul from doing so unless it obtains consent from Washington. A joint fact sheet on security agreed by the leaders of the two countries in a summit last year said that the U.S. supports this process. Both sides discussed a timeline for follow-up talks, with plans to hold them in Washington as early as next month. North Korea has lashed out at the U.S. over a controversial remark by a top American military commander, likening South Korea to, quote, the dagger in the heart of Asia. A state media KCNA ran a commentary saying that the remark exposes Washington's strategy to use Seoul as a tool to contain Beijing, accusing the U.S. of being a destabilizing force and pursuing a new Cold War. General Xavier Bronson made the comment in a recent interview. He's the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, where 28,500 American troops are stationed, primarily to deter threats from the north. But the U.S. has pushed for what it calls strategic flexibility, that is, to allow troops in Korea to support broader missions in the Indo-Pacific. Now, the remarks also drawing criticism from China, Beijing's embassy in Seoul calling them hostile and questioning whether they reflect official U.S. policy. South Korean media say Seoul has raised concerns with Washington. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, heavy rains lashing Tokyo, suspending some rail services and raising flood risks. Severe tropical storm Jangmi is bringing heavy rain to Tokyo, raising flood and landslide risks across the capital region. Well, the storm earlier made landfall in Wakayama Prefecture in western Japan. It hit the Miyazaki, Kagoshima, and Okinawa prefectures. More than a dozen people have been injured. Evacuation advisories have been issued to residents across 8 prefectures. The storm also cut power to nearly 60,000 homes. Officials have also reported flooding, fallen trees, debris, and landslide across affected areas. Residents have been urged to remain on alert. Now, the storm has also disrupted travel, it seems. Japan Airlines and All Nippon Airways have cancelled more than 800 domestic and international flights, and about 90,000 passengers were affected as a result. Some bullet train services in Kyushu and western Japan have also been delayed, while rail services in parts of Tokyo have been suspended. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged countries to take action as he warned that El Nino is expected to arrive in the coming months. He cited an update from the World Meteorological Organization.
The world must treat it as the urgent climate warning it is. El Nino conditions will pour fuel on the fire of a warming world. Impacts will hit even harder, travel even further, and cross borders with devastating speed. The only effective response is climate action equal to the crisis.
The UN Weather Agency says that above normal temperatures are expected across nearly all parts of the globe from June to August. It warns El Nino could intensify heat waves, droughts, and flooding, with knock-on effects for agriculture, water supplies, and human health. It looks like Japan's fertility rate has fallen to a new record low last year, despite years of government efforts to encourage people to have more children. Official data show the rate slipped to 1.14 in 2025, marking the 10th straight year of decline. The number of babies born in Japan also hit a record low, falling to about 671,000. Now, at the same time, deaths reached around 1.59 million, meaning Japan's population shrank by about 918,000 through natural causes alone. The government has spent billions of dollars on family support, including expanded child allowances and childcare subsidies. But officials say economic pressure, job insecurity, and the challenge of balancing work and family life continue to weigh on birth rates. Japan is one of the world's oldest societies. Fewer workers means less tax money and more spending on pensions and healthcare. Japan is not alone in this problem. South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan also struggling with fertility rates below 1. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has met the country's women's football champions following their recent victories in regional tournaments. State television KRT showed Mr. Kim greeting players from Naegohyang Women's Football Club and the national under-17 women's team in Pyongyang. Players were seen cheering and embracing the leader as he shook hands with team members and coaching staff before posing for group photographs. Mr. Kim later watched a friendly match between the two sides alongside senior officials. Now, Naegohyang made history last month by winning the AFC Women's Champions League, defeating Japan's Tokyo Verdy in the final. The victory also secured them a place in next year's FIFA Women's Champions Cup. The team had traveled to South Korea in May for the tournament, marking the first visit by North Korean athletes to the South in 8 years. Our tickets for K-pop boy band BTS's concert tour in Singapore are going on resale sites for up to 23 times their original price. Now, checks by CNA on ticket broker StubHub showed scalpers offering a single VIP ticket by the stage at close to, get this, $9,000. Now, that's nearly 23 times the official price. Listings also appeared on online platform Carousel as soon as 20 minutes after the official pre-sale began at noon on Wednesday. One post shows a set of 4 VIP tickets being offered for about $6,700. One fan says it took her more than 3 hours to secure seats, and she left nothing to chance.
My husband's actually working from home today, and the kids at home because it's the school holidays. I was like, okay, the TV's Wi-Fi is off. Everything else is in airplane mode. Only the things that I'm using for ticketing are actually on Wi-Fi. And then I have the phone 5G as a backup as well.
Now, ahead of the sale, the Consumers Association of Singapore and the police both issued advisories warning against ticket scams. They urged fans to buy tickets from only official channels and emphasized that those who purchase from unauthorized sellers may be denied entry to the event. SPF says they've also asked Carousel to take down resale listings. I hope you've enjoyed this Wednesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. And you can also find us on Facebook and YouTube and all the other socials. Thanks for watching, and see you again tomorrow.